407 years ago, our fathers brought forth of this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives, that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a large sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here.
Following the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter, Minnesota was the first state in the Union to pledge troops. Governor Ramsey sent a single telegraph line from Washington, and immediately the land of 10,000 lakes began to mobilize its young men for war.
This was a young state that realized that Easterners didn't know what these Minnesotans were like. You know, were they just a bunch of ne'er-do-wells? The rest of the nation would have to support them. What kind of people were they? And so when the regiment went out to fight in Virginia, Governor Ramsey's wife gave a speech in which she said, you know, the reputation of this state rests on your shoulders.
So the first Minnesota had something to prove. They were a fairly new state. They were kind of the new kids on the block. They were perceived by the Yankees from New England, sort of the elite states, as somewhat a bunch of frontier hicks in some ways.
A lot of people are very familiar with some of the main parts of the Civil War, and especially the Battle of Gettysburg, of course. And we think of Gettysburg, there are a lot of the times that people talk about things like Pickett's Charge gets a lot of the talk, or people talk about the battle for Little Round Top, but not as many people are aware of the crucial role that Minnesota played in the Battle of Gettysburg.
The Battle of Gettysburg proved to be a turning point in the war. After a string of impressive victories, Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army had pushed far into Northern Territory.
Lee had, by this time, scored about 4 or 5 major victories in a row over the Union generals, and so to add a 6th on top of that would have been a body blow to Northern morale, really.
General Lee didn't necessarily need to actually conquer the North with his excursion at Gettysburg. He just needed a victory to prove that he could win on Northern soil, which would show the world, and especially Europe, more specifically England and France, which were large consumers of the cotton produced in the South, that the South actually had a legitimate chance of winning the war. It was really very similar to how George Washington, during the Revolution, needed French support to defeat the British. What the South needed was an ally.
If he could defeat the Union Army up in their home turf in Pennsylvania, then he felt, and the Confederate government felt, that France and England would say, okay, this has gone on long enough, for 2 years now, there's no chance that the Union is going to win. We will recognize the Confederacy as a separate nation, and that would have had devastating consequences for the North.
A Union defeat at Gettysburg would have made a Confederate States of America all but inevitable.
I've read a great book we have here in our school library entitled The Last Full Measure. The title, of course, The Last Full Measure, comes from Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, a book written by Richard Moll. And in this it tells firsthand stories from men who were there. They wrote back in letters and shared what happened.
Now, on the second day of fighting at Gettysburg, the battle was quite intense, and for some reason, General Sickles, the Union general in command of the 3rd Corps, had decided to move his troops forward from the line they were and move them forward into the field. And this left a huge hole right where his troops were supposed to be. And General Lee, as usual, took advantage of all mistakes, and it was looking like he was going to use this and just be victorious at Gettysburg.
There was this 1,000-foot gap in the line, basically, and the Minnesota regiment was about the only unit in that 1,000-feet sector. And the Confederates, these troops from Alabama, were charging up Cemetery Ridge, and the Union General, Winfield Scott Hancock, he badly needed 10 minutes of time, basically.
And Hancock looked at the 262 men of the 1st Minnesota, and he exclaimed, "My God, are these all the men we have here?"
And so it came to be that the fate of a young nation rested on the ability of Union forces to repel a single Confederate assault. The Union lines were spread too thin, and their leaders knew it. A rebel charge would break the line and secure a Confederate victory at Gettysburg.
And the Confederates were advancing, so they needed 5 minutes to get those reserve brigades in position. And the first Union troops he saw happened to be the 1st Minnesota. So he yells at the colonel and he says, "Get in there and take those colors! Charge the rebels!"
Every man realized in an instant what that order meant. Death or wounds to us all. The sacrifice of the regiment to gain a few minutes' time and save the position, probably even the battlefield.
They were outnumbered 4-1. It was basically a suicide mission, but the colonel, he gives the order and Minnesota charges, and they hold them off for 5 minutes, and they basically saved the day at Gettysburg.
They were charging a Confederate unit that was about 4 times their size, so they knew that it was, a sacrificial, almost suicidal charge.
This particular instance at Gettysburg is one of the least known stories of heroism in all of American history. People know about the Alamo, they know about D-Day, but most people have never heard of the 1st Minnesota's basically suicide charge at Gettysburg, and it's on such small moments as these that history turns. They sacrificed their lives to buy 5 minutes of time, and in the end it very well may have saved the Union.
I think the time that I saw Midwestern Minnesota values, if you will, really at work was last summer. It was the day after Glenwood, Minnesota's Waterama celebration, and from Sunday evening the lake was calm, the sun was setting, everybody had a great weekend. The very next day, hurricane force winds come through and literally devastate. Lots of trees down, boats off their lifts. The place just looked like twisted steel.
70-mile-an-hour winds actually hit this town of Glenwood this morning. Take a look. Strong winds actually toppled this old tree right in the heart of town. And you look over here, there is more damage all across this area. Live at 10 o'clock that still needs to be cleaned up here in Glenwood everywhere you look.
And you didn't hear anybody from that community say, "Woe is us, come help us." Frankly, they said, kind of stay away because it's safe. But what people did there is they got out their chainsaw and they started cutting up trees, and they helped their neighbors cut up trees and hauled the brush around and just went to work doing what rural Minnesota people do, is helping each other in times of need.
Am I willing then to step in my community, to make contributions, to volunteer, to step out of my box, so to speak, and to fill in that gap with programs that are going to be missing? Can I help my neighbor? I need to help my neighbor. That is a very basic element of our country and what we believe in.
The local values we have here, people want to provide for themselves, they want to provide for their family, they want to provide for others, they want to provide for friends and for people in their church and people around them.
I think that we all can do our own parts to better our communities. One of the things that I did after 9/11, I'd always had an interest in being a fireman and firefighting, and something about 9/11 actually spurred me to go and to check it out a little bit, and I actually then signed up in Lake Henry, and I've been a volunteer fireman for 10 years now, and it's definitely not something that you're going and risking your life and limb to make money. This is something that I just feel that is something to do for our community, and people typically think of the firemen fighting fires, but that's just a very small percentage of what we do. I mean, we are called out when there are accidents. We are helping to extricate people, use jaws of life, get people out of vehicles. Quite often on medicals, we are the first responders. We are the ones who are there. And I think that it's just important for each of us to find those niches that we can fill within our community, where we can volunteer, where we can help out.
I've lived on the East Coast and the West Coast, and one thing that I really like about living here in Minnesota is that people are very down to earth and sensible and have a hard work ethic. And even people that are making millions of dollars, you would never know it from the cars that they drive or the house that they live in. The lifestyle that they lead is just very down to earth and not at all pretentious. And I really want to raise a family in an environment where nobody's better than anybody else because of the money that they have or that they don't have.
I enjoy living in Minnesota because the people in Minnesota have great values, honest people, trustworthy, hardworking, willing to give you a chance to succeed. They don't distrust you immediately like other parts of the country.
I'm originally from Battle Lake. I grew up there. We've lived in Wilmer for 16 years. We actually spent a lot of time out of state for several years. My wife was in the military, and we always wanted to get back to Minnesota. We wanted to raise our kids here, knowing what a great environment we have. Of course, we have the natural beauty of lakes and everything, as well as just great communities.
Culture in Minnesota, we still have stuck to those true American roots of, do what you say you're going to do, work hard, make the most of your opportunities that are given to you, and don't depend on anybody else to provide something for you, that you need to go out and get it yourself.
The original American values, the ideas that separate us from the rest of the world, seem to have taken root in the Midwest. States like Minnesota have been a vanguard for the ideas that make America, America.
We've had 5 foreign exchange students come to our home at different times. And one of the boys was from the Ukraine. And when he saw me driving my car back from the airport after picking him up in Minneapolis, he just kept staring at me. And I said, Yuri, why are you staring at me so much? He said, I've never seen a woman drive a car before. And look at the things their country couldn't do. And all the stuff that they were held back from, their creativity was held back.
Having lived in Europe, I can see the effect of heavy government hands and highly regulated states. And to me, it just seems that without that freedom to pursue happiness, a certain spark in the people is missing.
Being in America, we're all from someplace else. We all originally came here from someplace else with the idea of escaping tyranny, escaping oppression, escaping control.
Most nations can trace their heritage back for centuries and centuries and years. America can't. We're basically a nation of mutts. What makes America different is our value system, our ideas. There's not an American race or religion. It's our ideas, really. It's how you think.
Ideas move countries. That is what the Founding Fathers did when they talked about liberty, when they ultimately wrote the Declaration of Independence. There was, at the time of the founding of this country, there were many writers that were, and they wrote about ideas, and these ideas were published in papers and spread throughout the land, and that is what ultimately brought success, was the propagation of these ideas of freedom and liberty and individual rights.
I think with Midwestern values, and especially rural Minnesota, we don't have that sense of entitlement. We have a sense of working hard and earning what we work for. If you don't work, you don't eat.
I grew up as an only child. My mom was in a wheelchair growing up, and my dad left when I was 13 years old. When I was a senior in high school, I was forced to live on my own my senior year because my mom moved into a nursing home. And our society would maybe look at that as adversity. I think it created some valuable characteristics and traits, and I think that's valuable for society, because I think when we learn to become independent, we become to think, or we train ourselves to think for ourselves. We understand choices equal consequences. We understand that when we don't work hard, we're not blessed for it. When we work hard, we are blessed for it.
Well, I was raised on a dairy farm here in the Midwest. My dad still milks about 50 cows just outside of Lake Henry, kind of north of Paynesville. And I think there were a lot of advantages to growing up on a farm. I mean, it was just expected that you got up before sunrise, you worked hard, your parents counted on you, you were given responsibilities early on.
My grandpa used to get up early in the morning and get his crews pack lunches for the entire week and hit the road, and they'd go out and build pole barns, and they'd work sun up to sundown. It'd take them a full week to get the building done, but they'd get it done and they'd go home for the weekend, and then they'd get up and do the whole thing over again the next week. And I think that's something that stuck with us, and I think it's definitely just part of the culture around here. People work hard, and because they're working hard, they're able to make a pretty good living.
What should really be so alarming is the extent to which Greece is broke, because they were just as broke a couple of years ago, but no one cared, and they can keep borrowing money. That's the same situation that we have in America. We're just as broke, except that we can keep borrowing because people haven't figured it out yet.
It's a little bit disheartening for someone that's younger, looking at this huge burden of debt and this huge growing population that's just dependent on the government for things. And you think, man, I'm going to be working to try and pay all this stuff off now for the next 40, 50, till I die, 40, 50 years.
The United States is at a crossroads today. We have some great decisions to make, and those decisions are going to affect not only the next generation, but they're going to affect generations for generations to come.
In the same way that Minnesotans bravely volunteered in the early days of the Civil War, eventually sacrificing their very lives to hold the line at Gettysburg, it's time for the heartland to rise up again and defend America.
It is time for us to realize that we're too great a nation to limit ourselves to small dreams. We're not, as some would have us believe, doomed to an inevitable decline. I do not believe in a fate that will fall on us no matter what we do. I do believe in a fate that will fall on us if we do nothing. So with all the creative energy at our command, let us begin an era of national renewal. Let us renew our determination, our courage, and our strength. And let us renew our faith and our hope. We have every right to dream heroic dreams.
America's always been a come-from-behind kind of nation. The American Revolution, the War of 1812, World War II. This gives us all great hope for America's future, that we have the ability, the strength, the power to force through any obstacle that stands in our way.
So often as we read history, we read of great nations who have failed. But I really believe that America can be the first nation in the history of mankind to achieve a certain pinnacle of greatness and lose sight of the character that built itself to that greatness, but then recover and possibly become even greater than it was before.
We haven't got to the point of no return yet where we've just given up. There's still strong leaders in our country. There's very intelligent people in this great nation. And as those people come together with great ideas, the problems that we face today, economically speaking, especially surmounting debt, high interest rates, things that possibly could be coming, I think can be overcome with strong leadership.
We have never actively been involved in a campaign. We have watched campaigns on TV. We've made decisions, made wise decisions based on research, but we've never taken an advocate's role for a particular candidate, and Lee is different in that way.
I was born about 50 years ago now in America. After some time, my parents took me to South America, where they served as missionary in Brazil and Paraguay, and they learned what it takes, or what you experience when you don't have freedom. Later on, I grew up my teenage years in Norway, went to high school, and that's where I picked up the Minnesota accent.
I think he is rural Minnesota, and he lives our values, and I don't think he's going to forget all that when he goes to Washington.
Well, I am a citizen first and foremost, but have had a lot of years around a lot of politicians as a broadcaster, radio talk show host. And I always tell folks I can spot a phony a mile away. And quite honestly, there's phonies that are Republicans, there's phonies that are Democrats, there's phonies that wannabes. Lee is just real. You know, he really is. And so I think Lee will be different, and I think Lee is different because you really get a sense that this is not about him. This is about us.
The first time I met Lee, it was at a convention a couple of years ago, and I heard him speak, and I thought, this is the guy that really makes sense. What he was saying made sense to me more than any other candidate that I've heard in a long time.
Well, you know, I met Lee 2 years ago when he was first started running for Congress, and it was a breath of fresh air to hear somebody actually talk about the Constitution, talk about liberty.
He gets the idea of what the Founding Fathers envisioned in the way of a citizen legislator.
It's time that we change the system, and people have said that for years, but it is time. There's no time like the present, and every time there's an election, everybody says it's going to be different, and nobody does anything about it. Lee's model is going to change the way campaigns are done.
Unfortunately, we see more and more intrusion into our activities, into our pocketbooks, and we think it's time that we actually try to send some of our values to Washington.
As much as Midwestern values or trends come from the coasts, I think it's time for some Midwestern values to start in the Midwest and spread east and west.
The same rugged pioneer spirit that enabled the first Minnesota to lead the way in 1863 is still alive in 2012. Our struggle is not one of swords or guns, it's one of ideas. Remember, ideas have consequences.
It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.